On a cold morning in the spring of 1944, long before the sun had climbed above the English countryside, hundreds of American airmen quietly gathered inside a briefing room somewhere in eastern England. They had followed the same routine dozens of times before. Coffee sat untouched on tables. Cigarette smoke drifted lazily toward the ceiling. Mechanics were already outside, inspecting engines beneath floodlights, while crews waited for the large curtain at the front of the room to be pulled back. Everyone already knew what was coming. Another mission. Another flight across the English Channel. Another journey deep into Nazi Germany. For many of the young men sitting inside that room, the odds were becoming impossible to ignore. Bomber crews serving in the United States Army Air Forces faced one of the deadliest assignments of the entire war. Completing 25 combat missions, the number originally required before rotating home, was considered a remarkable achievement. Many crews never came close. The statistics were frightening. Every mission meant flying directly into the heart of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. German radar detected them hours before they arrived. Anti-aircraft batteries waited beneath carefully planned flight paths. Fighter squadrons stood ready to intercept. If the bombers reached their targets, they still had to make the entire journey back. Every successful mission demanded endurance, discipline, and no small amount of luck. As the curtain finally opened, silence filled the room. A map of Europe appeared. A red string stretched from England across the North Sea, into occupied Europe, and finally toward an industrial city deep inside Germany. A collective sigh spread across the crews. It would be another long flight. One that would take them far beyond the protection of friendly territory. One that many would not return from. Among the dozens of bomber crews receiving their assignments that morning was the crew of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress commanded by First Lieutenant James H. Wilkinson. Wilkinson wasn't famous. He wasn't a decorated ace. He wasn't the kind of officer whose name appeared in newspapers back home. Like thousands of other American pilots serving in England, he simply did his job. His crew trusted him completely. That trust had been earned through months of training. Unlike fighter pilots, bomber crews depended entirely on teamwork. A B-17 carried 10 men. Each possessed a responsibility that affected everyone else. The pilot and co-pilot flew the aircraft. The navigator guided them across hundreds of miles using maps, dead reckoning, and celestial navigation. The bombardier aimed the bombs during the final run toward the target. The radio operator maintained communication. Engineers monitored engines and fuel systems. Waist gunners, tail gunners, top turret gunners, and nose gunners defended the bomber against relentless attacks from enemy fighters. If one man failed, the entire crew suffered. Inside the Flying Fortress, every position mattered. The B-17 itself had already become legendary by 1944. Manufactured by Boeing, it represented one of America's greatest engineering achievements of the war. Powered by 4 massive radial engines, the aircraft could carry thousands of pounds of bombs while flying higher than many enemy fighters preferred to operate. Its nickname, Flying Fortress, came from the impressive array of defensive machine guns protecting nearly every direction. To young American crews arriving in England, the B-17 inspired confidence. It looked unstoppable, heavy, powerful, solid. Veteran crews knew better. The bomber was exceptionally durable. It was not invincible. German fighters had already destroyed hundreds of them. Flak batteries had torn entire formations apart. Returning with severe battle damage was common. Returning at all was never guaranteed. After the briefing ended, the crews climbed aboard trucks that carried them toward the airfield. The morning air remained bitterly cold. Rows of silver bombers stretched across the horizon, each already loaded with fuel, ammunition, and bombs. Ground crews made final inspections while pilots walked slowly around their aircraft. Wilkinson followed the same habit before every mission. He personally inspected each engine, checked landing gear, examined the wings, ran his hand across the aluminum skin near the cockpit. Some pilots considered it superstition. Others called it respect. To Wilkinson, the airplane deserved both. Within an hour, engines thundered to life. One after another, hundreds of propellers blurred into motion. The sound became almost impossible to describe. Thousands of horsepower shook the ground itself. Crew chiefs stepped back. Signal lights flashed. The bombers slowly taxied toward the runway. Then, one by one, they lifted into the gray English sky. The first stage of every mission remained surprisingly peaceful. As the formation assembled above England, bombers circled until every assigned squadron found its proper position. Navigation demanded remarkable precision. Hundreds of aircraft needed to fly together while maintaining safe separation. The formations looked almost beautiful from a distance. Sunlight reflected across polished aluminum. Long contrails stretched behind the bombers as they climbed higher. Inside the aircraft, however, beauty quickly disappeared. Temperatures at operational altitude often fell far below freezing. Crew members wore electrically heated flight suits beneath layers of heavy clothing. Even then, frost frequently formed inside the aircraft. The bomber possessed no pressurized cabin. Oxygen masks remained essential. Communication occurred through intercom systems connecting every crew station. Hours passed. The English coastline slowly disappeared behind them. Ahead waited occupied Europe. Everyone knew what happened next. The closer they approached Germany, the more dangerous the sky became. The first warning rarely came from enemy aircraft. Instead, the navigator usually noticed black clouds appearing far below. Not weather, flak. German anti-aircraft artillery had become extraordinarily sophisticated by 1944. Radar tracked incoming formations. Fire control computers calculated altitude, speed, and direction. Massive 88mm guns fired shells programmed to explode at precisely calculated heights. Unlike fighter attacks, flak required no direct hit. A shell bursting nearby could spray hundreds of steel fragments through an aircraft. Sometimes a single fragment cut hydraulic lines. Sometimes it severed control cables. Sometimes it struck fuel tanks. Sometimes it found a crew member. Soon the peaceful sky erupted into black explosions. 1, then 5, then dozens. Entire walls of flak surrounded the bomber stream. The aircraft shook violently each time another shell burst nearby. Inside Wilkinson's cockpit, no one spoke unnecessarily. The pilot focused entirely on maintaining formation. That discipline proved critical. Breaking formation exposed bombers to German fighters. Remaining together increased everyone's chance of survival. Then the radio operator reported the words every crew dreaded. Bandits. German fighters approached. Fast. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots had spent years perfecting attacks against American bomber formations. They understood exactly where the flying fortress remained vulnerable. Some attacked from the front, where closing speeds exceeded 600 miles per hour. Others attacked from above. Others from directly behind. Their objective remained simple: destroy the bombers before they reached the target. Moments later, the first fighters appeared. Tiny specks quickly grew into unmistakable silhouettes. Messerschmitt Bf 109, Focke-Wulf FW 190. Their cannons flashed almost immediately. American gunners answered with streams of 50 caliber fire. The peaceful formation dissolved into organized chaos. Tracer rounds crossed the sky from every direction. Smoke poured from damaged aircraft. One bomber rolled slowly onto its side before disappearing beneath the clouds. Another lost an engine but stubbornly remained with the formation. Wilkinson concentrated on holding course. The target still lay ahead. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion erupted beneath the right wing. The aircraft lurched violently. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit. One engine immediately lost power. The engineer shouted over the intercom. Engine 3's hit. Before anyone could respond, Another flak burst exploded almost directly beside them. The bomber shuddered with unbelievable force. Crew members throughout the aircraft heard a horrifying metallic tearing sound. The entire airplane rolled sharply to the right. For one terrifying moment, everyone believed the wing had broken completely away. Wilkinson fought desperately against the controls. The bomber slowly responded, barely. The co-pilot looked toward the damaged wing. His face turned pale. He spoke only 4 words. "My God, half it's gone." The massive flak explosion had torn away an enormous section of the outer wing. Jagged aluminum protruded into empty air. Fuel streamed behind the aircraft. Control surfaces barely responded. By every law of aerodynamics, the Flying Fortress should already have been falling. Instead, against every expectation, it continued flying. But getting home would become the greatest challenge the crew had ever faced. For several long seconds after the explosion, no one inside the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress spoke. There wasn't time. Training immediately took over. Every crew member had rehearsed emergency procedures dozens of times back in England, but no amount of preparation could truly prepare a man for what they were now seeing. The bomber had just survived one of the most devastating anti-aircraft hits imaginable. The aircraft wasn't simply damaged. It had been torn apart. From the cockpit, First Lieutenant James H. Wilkinson struggled to understand what the controls were telling him. The yoke suddenly felt different. Heavy. Uneven. The bomber wanted to roll constantly toward the damaged side. He found himself pulling against the controls with far more strength than normal, while using opposite rudder just to keep the aircraft flying straight. Beside him, the co-pilot stared through the side window. The right wing no longer resembled a wing at all. A huge section of its outer structure had disappeared. Jagged aluminum ribs stretched into open air like broken bones. Large pieces of torn metal fluttered violently in the rushing wind. Fuel streamed backward in a long mist behind the airplane. Everyone expected the remaining section to collapse at any second. Yet somehow, it held. The engineer quickly began reading instrument gauges. Engine 3's gone. Hydraulic pressure dropping. Fuel leak on the right side. Another warning light illuminated. Electrical damage. Then another. One oxygen line had been severed. Inside the fuselage, the radio operator reported additional problems. Shrapnel had ripped through communication equipment. Several radio frequencies were no longer functioning. The bomber had become partially isolated. Then came another report. The waist gunner had been wounded. A fragment of flak had sliced through the side of the aircraft before striking his shoulder. Fortunately, the injury wasn't immediately life-threatening. The crew's medic training kicked in instantly. Bandages, morphine, pressure. The gunner refused evacuation from his position. "I can still shoot." Nobody argued. Every functioning machine gun might soon become the difference between life and death. Because the German fighters had noticed something. One bomber was falling behind, and wounded bombers became irresistible targets. Within minutes, another group of Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters broke away from the main battle and turned directly toward Wilkinson's crippled Flying Fortress. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots understood exactly what they were seeing. A damaged bomber, reduced speed, separated from its formation. Normally, such aircraft rarely survived the trip home. The first attack came from behind. The tail gunner immediately opened fire. Streams of .50 caliber tracer rounds stretched across the sky. One German fighter broke away sharply. Another continued closing. Its 20mm cannons flashed. Shells slammed into the bomber's fuselage. Metal fragments exploded through the interior. One waist gun shattered. More holes appeared throughout the aircraft. The pilot ignored all of it. His entire focus remained fixed upon one objective: keep flying. If the damaged wing stalled, they would all die. The flying fortress had suddenly become an enormous balancing act. Wilkinson couldn't allow the aircraft to climb too steeply. The weakened wing might fail under additional stress. He couldn't descend too rapidly either. Increased airspeed would place even greater force upon the damaged structure. Every movement of the controls had to remain smooth, gentle, deliberate. It was less like flying, and more like carefully convincing the airplane to stay together. The bomber slowly drifted away from the main formation. Other American crews looked across in disbelief. Several later recalled seeing the aircraft and assuming no one aboard could possibly survive. One navigator reportedly remarked over the intercom that the bomber looked held together by prayer. Even escort fighters noticed. North American P-51 Mustang pilots quickly moved toward the crippled B-17, intercepting German fighters before they could organize another coordinated attack. The Mustangs had transformed the air war over Europe. Earlier in the bombing campaign, heavy bombers frequently crossed Germany without long-range fighter protection. Losses had been catastrophic. Now, with the arrival of the P-51, escort fighters could remain beside bomber formations almost all the way to the target and back. For Wilkinson's crew, those Mustangs arrived at exactly the right moment. Several German fighters attempted one final pass. American escorts intercepted them. Within seconds, twisting dogfights filled the sky. The damaged flying fortress quietly slipped away from the battle. Inside the aircraft, another problem emerged. Fuel. The engineer recalculated remaining reserves. The leak had become worse than anyone first believed. Enough fuel remained to reach England. Perhaps, but there would be almost no margin for error. Every unnecessary maneuver consumed precious gasoline. Every extra minute in the air increased the risk of total engine failure. The crew made another difficult decision. They could no longer remain at normal bombing altitude. The damaged wing simply generated too little lift. Wilkinson slowly began descending. Not rapidly, just enough to reduce strain on the aircraft. At lower altitude, however, another danger appeared. Enemy anti-aircraft guns. Fortunately, most heavy flak batteries concentrated upon the main bomber formations continuing toward the target. The crippled B-17 gradually slipped beneath the larger battle unfolding high above Germany. Hours now seemed to pass in complete silence. No one joked anymore. No one discussed what had happened. Every crew member quietly performed his duties. The navigator carefully calculated the shortest route home. The engineer continuously monitored engine temperatures. The wounded gunner remained at his position, despite increasing blood loss. The radio operator attempted to restore damaged communications. The pilot simply flew. At one point, the co-pilot finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. "Do you think she'll make it?" Wilkinson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked once more toward the ruined wing. The wind continued ripping at the torn aluminum. Every vibration traveled through the control column. Every gust seemed capable of finishing what the flak had started. Finally, he replied, "As long as she keeps flying." "So will we." The crew accepted that answer. It was enough. Eventually, the gray waters of the North Sea appeared beneath them. For the first time all day, they had left enemy territory. No German fighters. No flak. Only the long journey home. Most crews would have relaxed. Wilkinson's crew couldn't. The greatest danger still remained. The damaged wing had survived combat. Could it survive another 200 miles? Every minute exposed the broken structure to relentless aerodynamic stress. Metal fatigue accumulated constantly. Tiny cracks invisible to the eye slowly spread beneath the remaining skin of the wing. No engineer aboard truly knew how much longer it could endure. The flying fortress had exceeded every reasonable expectation. It was flying on borrowed time. Then another warning arrived. The engineer looked toward the cockpit. "We're losing hydraulic pressure faster." The landing gear, brakes, flaps. Every major system depended upon hydraulics. If pressure dropped too far, landing would become nearly impossible. Wilkinson quietly nodded. One crisis at a time. First, reach England. Then, figure out how to land. Several hours after leaving Germany, the first glimpse of the English coastline finally appeared through the haze. No one cheered. Relief mixed with uncertainty. Getting home and landing safely were two entirely different challenges. Airfields across eastern England soon received reports about the incoming bomber. Controllers initially assumed the damage reports had been exaggerated. Then someone spotted the aircraft approaching. The control tower fell silent. Ground crews walked outside. Mechanics shaded their eyes against the afternoon sun. Even experienced officers struggled to believe what they were seeing. A flying fortress, missing nearly half of one wing, was somehow still airborne. Emergency vehicles immediately rushed toward the runway. Fire crews prepared for disaster. Ambulances waited nearby. Everyone expected the bomber to crash before reaching the ground. No one had ever seen an aircraft this badly damaged continue flying for so long. The hardest part of the mission was still ahead. The first people to see the damaged Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress approaching the English coast couldn't believe what they were looking at. At first, the aircraft appeared to be flying normally. Then, as it drew closer, the impossible became visible. The right wing looked as if a giant had torn a massive piece away with his bare hands. The smooth shape that gave the Flying Fortress its lift had been replaced by twisted aluminum, shattered ribs, and jagged metal fluttering violently in the wind. Ground crews stopped what they were doing. Mechanics left maintenance hangars. Truck drivers climbed out of their vehicles. Even experienced pilots standing near the runway instinctively removed their caps and stared into the sky. Many of them had returned with damaged bombers before. Missing engines, shot-up fuselages, destroyed tails, hundreds of bullet holes. They had seen almost everything. Almost. But no one remembered seeing a B-17 with so much of one wing simply gone. Inside the cockpit, First Lieutenant James H. Wilkinson wasn't thinking about making history. He was thinking about surviving the next few minutes. Flying the crippled bomber across Germany had been difficult. Landing it would be even harder. A damaged aircraft behaves very differently during landing than it does in level flight. As an airplane slows down, its wings produce less lift. To compensate, pilots normally lower flaps, adjust power, and carefully balance the aircraft until touchdown. Wilkinson no longer possessed that luxury. The damaged wing produced significantly less lift than the other. If the airplane became too slow, the weakened side could stall first. If that happened, the bomber would roll violently toward the broken wing. At such a low altitude, recovery would be impossible. He quietly reviewed every possibility. Too fast. The landing gear might collapse. Too slow. The aircraft could flip over before reaching the runway. Too much braking. The bomber might veer sideways. Every decision carried enormous risk. The control tower contacted the crew. Flying Fortress, emergency services are standing by. Wilkinson acknowledged the transmission calmly. His voice gave no indication of the battle they had just survived. On the ground, fire trucks lined both sides of the runway. Ambulances waited nearby. Medical personnel prepared stretchers. Crash crews positioned foam equipment in case the leaking fuel ignited. Nobody expected the landing to end well. Some officers privately wondered whether the pilot should order the crew to bail out over England instead. But that option had already become too dangerous. The aircraft was too low, too slow, and several crew members were wounded. Their only realistic chance was landing. Inside the bomber, the atmosphere remained strangely peaceful. Hours earlier, the crew had fought for survival over Germany. Now there was nothing left to shoot, nothing left to repair, only trust remained. The navigator quietly folded his maps. The bombardier removed unnecessary equipment from around his station. The wounded waist gunner checked his machine gun one final time before finally allowing another crewman to help him sit down. The engineer monitored the engines constantly. All four no longer worked perfectly. One had already failed. Another produced fluctuating power. The remaining engines carried the burden of keeping the battered bomber airborne just a little longer. The co-pilot looked outside again. The damaged wing still flexed unnervingly with every gust of wind. Small pieces of aluminum occasionally tore away and disappeared behind the aircraft. He stopped watching. There was no point anymore. If the wing failed, nothing could prevent the crash. Wilkinson lowered the landing gear. For several tense seconds, nothing happened. Then, a reassuring mechanical vibration passed through the aircraft. The engineer checked the indicator lights. Gear down. One problem solved. The flaps presented another challenge. Normally they slowed the aircraft and increased lift during landing. With such severe structural damage, deploying them unevenly could place unpredictable stress on the wing. Wilkinson elected to use only minimal flap settings. It meant approaching the runway faster than normal. Much faster. The bomber began its final descent. From the ground, spectators watched in absolute silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the roar of the engines seemed strangely subdued beneath the tension hanging over the airfield. The Flying Fortress approached lower and lower. The damaged wing dipped suddenly. Gasps spread across the runway. Wilkinson instinctively corrected with opposite controls. The bomber leveled once more. Barely. One mechanic later admitted he was certain the airplane would crash right then. Instead, it continued descending. The runway rushed beneath them. "Easy," the co-pilot whispered. No one else answered. The wheels touched the concrete. Not gently, but firmly. The aircraft bounced once. The weakened wing shuddered violently. Everyone inside expected to hear the terrifying sound of structural failure. Instead, the landing gear held. Wilkinson carefully lowered the nose. The bomber continued rolling. Faster than normal. Longer than normal. He avoided heavy braking, allowing the aircraft to slow naturally before gradually applying the brakes. The Flying Fortress drifted slightly toward one side of the runway, then straightened. Finally, after one of the most extraordinary flights of the war, the aircraft came to a complete stop. For several moments, nobody inside moved. The engines idled quietly. Outside, emergency vehicles remained frozen. It took a second for everyone to realize what had just happened. They had actually landed. The silence suddenly broke. Ground crews sprinted toward the bomber. Firefighters surrounded the aircraft. Medics climbed aboard. Mechanics immediately began examining the damaged wing. Within minutes, word spread across the entire airbase. "You have to see this." Personnel from neighboring squadrons walked toward the parked Flying Fortress. Pilots, armorers, engineers, even senior officers. They gathered beneath the shattered wing and simply stared. The damage looked even worse from the ground. Entire structural sections had disappeared. Large portions of the wing's outer skin were completely gone. Support ribs remained exposed to open air. One engineer reportedly shook his head and quietly said, "I don't know how this airplane stayed together." Neither did anyone else. The official inspection revealed an astonishing level of destruction. The flak explosion had ripped away a massive section of the outer wing, while damaging internal structural members, fuel lines, electrical wiring, and control systems. By conventional engineering standards, the aircraft should never have completed the journey back across Europe. Yet it had. The inspection also highlighted something engineers had known for years, but now saw proven beyond any doubt. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had been designed with extraordinary structural redundancy. Its wing spars, reinforced framework, multiple control systems, and rugged construction allowed it to absorb punishment that would have destroyed many other aircraft. The Flying Fortress earned its nickname honestly. It wasn't indestructible. Thousands had been lost during the war. Many crews never returned. But stories like Wilkinson's became powerful reminders of just how remarkably resilient the aircraft could be. For the crew themselves, however, the airplane represented something far more personal. It wasn't simply aluminum, or rivets, or engineering. It had become the only reason 10 young Americans were still alive. Years later, surviving crew members rarely described themselves as heroes. When interviewed after the war, many bomber veterans said essentially the same thing. They trusted one another. They trusted their training, and they trusted their airplane. Wilkinson shared that mindset. When people praised his skill, he redirected the credit to his crew, to the engineers who built the aircraft, to the mechanics who maintained it before every mission, because he understood something history sometimes forgets. No pilot lands an airplane alone. Behind every successful mission stood hundreds of unseen people. Ground crews working through freezing nights, factory workers assembling aircraft thousands of miles away, engineers solving problems long before the war began, and 9 other men inside the bomber, each performing his duty despite fear, exhaustion, and injury. The story of the pilot who landed with half a wing missing isn't simply about one extraordinary flight. It is about teamwork under impossible circumstances. It is about calm decisions made while death seemed only seconds away. It is about the remarkable engineering of an aircraft that repeatedly exceeded every expectation placed upon it. Most importantly, it reminds us that history is filled with moments that seem too unbelievable to be true. A bomber that should have fallen from the sky, a wing that should have broken apart, a crew that should never have reached home. Yet somehow, against every prediction, against every probability, against every law that seemed to govern survival in war, they crossed the North Sea. They found their runway. They rolled to a stop, and 10 exhausted Americans climbed out of a broken flying fortress, looked back at the shattered wing that had carried them home, and realized they had just lived through a story that would be remembered for generations.